January 1945. A winter morning settles over a fence compound somewhere in Western Europe. The ground is hard with frost. Breath hangs briefly in the air before vanishing. Inside the barracks, the day begins the same way it always does: roll calls, ration lines. The quiet discipline of captivity. These are not soldiers from the front lines. They are women. Clerks, radio operators, nurses, auxiliaries of a collapsing Reich. Many are barely in their 20s. Their uniforms are worn now, stripped of insignia, folded carefully beside thin blankets. Outside, American guards move through routine with practiced calm. No shouting, no hurry. Wars train everyone here to expect the worst. For the prisoners, captivity means hunger, humiliation, uncertainty. German briefings had prepared them for brutality, especially from the enemy. They were told to fear most. The United States Army was supposed to be harsh, vindictive, indifferent. Then, on this particular morning, something breaks the pattern. A name is read aloud. Then another. A small administrative pause follows. What arrives next does not fit the rules of war they thought they understood. And in that moment, the distance between propaganda and reality quietly begins to collapse. The reason for that moment lies far beyond this camp, in how the war itself had reached this point. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its final, irreversible phase. The Allied landings in Normandy the previous June had shattered Germany's western defenses. What followed was not a single collapse, but a grinding retreat, measured in ruined towns, broken divisions, and increasingly desperate mobilization orders issued from Berlin. Germany no longer had the luxury of selective service. Men were gone, killed, wounded, captured, or absorbed into formations that existed more on paper than in reality. To keep the war machine functioning, the Reich expanded the use of women in uniformed auxiliary roles. They were not frontline combat troops, but they were essential. The Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe relied on Helferinnen, female auxiliaries trained as clerks, telephone operators, weather observers, typists, radar assistants, and medical orderlies. By 1944, hundreds of thousands of German women were serving in these capacities. Many were teenagers when they entered service. Training emphasized discipline, secrecy, and ideological loyalty. They were taught efficiency, not survival. Capture was discussed only briefly, often framed as unlikely or catastrophic. Enemy treatment, particularly by Western allies, was portrayed in stark terms: cold, exploitative, humiliating. The idea that an American-run camp would follow international law closely, or treat prisoners with procedural fairness, rarely appeared in official instruction. As Allied armies advanced across France, Belgium, and into Western Germany, these women were swept into the same current as the men. Radar stations were overrun. Field hospitals were abandoned. Signal offices were evacuated too late. Capture often came suddenly. A jeep appearing on a road where German vehicles had passed hours earlier, or infantry entering a town before evacuation orders reached the auxiliaries stationed there. Unlike combat soldiers, many of these women had never fired a weapon. Yet under international law, they were lawful prisoners of war. They wore uniforms. They served the German military. Their fate now depended on the systems and discipline of the captors, the United States Army. By late 1944, had already processed millions of enemy prisoners across multiple theaters. From North Africa to Italy, from Normandy to the hedgerows of France, American forces had developed a standardized approach to POW handling. Camps were not improvised punishments. They were administrative machines. Procedures govern everything: intake, medical inspection, rations, work assignments, mail, and recreation. The system was not born from sentiment. It was built on logistics, law, and long-term calculation. The Geneva Convention of 1929 dictated minimum standards for food, shelter, medical care, and treatment. The U.S. Army adhered to these standards not only out of obligation, but because discipline in captivity reduced unrest, simplified management, and projected legitimacy to the outside world. By the time German women began arriving in American-run camps in significant numbers, the process was already routine. Personal belongings were inventoried. Identification details were recorded. Haircuts, when required, were for sanitation, not humiliation. Barracks were segregated by gender. Medical examinations were conducted by trained personnel, often with Red Cross oversight. For the prisoners, however, the experience was disorienting. They arrived carrying expectations formed by years of propaganda and fear. Instead of violence, they encountered order. Instead of chaos, structure. Instead of shouting, paperwork. Yet this did not mean comfort. Food was adequate, but plain. Freedom was gone. News from home was scarce. The future was undefined. The war, still raging, pressed heavily on every mind. It was within this environment, controlled, restrained, emotionally tense that a small administrative detail would take an unexpected weight. A routine entry on a file card, a date of birth, a system that noticed it, that detail insignificant in any other context, would soon ripple through a camp that had learned to expect nothing but adherence. The American approach to prisoner of war administration was shaped long before the first German auxiliaries were captured in Western Europe. It had been designed in classrooms, war colleges, and planning offices where officers studied the failures of the previous World War. In 1918, the mistreatment of prisoners had left scars that lasted decades. In 1944, the U.S. Army was determined not to repeat that history. At the center of this system was predictability. Every camp followed a standardized framework. Prisoners were to be fed the same caloric intake as rear echelon American troops. Medical care was mandatory, not discretionary. Religious observance was permitted. Red Cross inspections were welcomed. These were not favors. They were rules. This structure created a psychological environment that differed sharply from what many German prisoners expected. The Reich had portrayed captivity as degradation, a place where identity would be stripped away, and dignity intentionally destroyed. Instead, American camps focused on containment rather than punishment. The goal was to hold prisoners securely, prevent escape, maintain order, and prepare for eventual repatriation once hostilities ended. For German women, the experience was even more unfamiliar. They occupied a space rarely discussed in wartime planning. Not civilians, but not frontline soldiers either. Many arrived wearing uniforms associated with clerical or medical service, symbols that blurred the rigid categories of combat and non-combat that propaganda had relied upon. The U.S. Army responded by categorizing them precisely. Female prisoners were housed separately. Work assignments, when given, aligned with non-combat tasks: laundry, kitchen assistance, administrative labor within the camp. Guard units were briefed carefully. Conduct was regulated. Any deviation could result in disciplinary action against the guard, not the prisoner. Food supply played a critical role in shaping daily life. By late 1944, American logistics were strained but stable. The Red Ball Express and established supply lines ensured that POW camps received regular deliveries. Rations were monotonous, but sufficient. Bread, soup, vegetables, sometimes meat. Occasionally, Red Cross parcels supplemented meals, powdered milk, chocolate, canned goods. These parcels carried emotional weight far beyond their nutritional value. They were tangible proof that the outside world still existed, that someone, somewhere, was keeping track. Administrative systems recorded everything: names, ranks, units, dates of capture, dates of birth. This last detail was collected without ceremony, a line on a form filled out during intake. For most prisoners, it meant nothing. Time in captivity blurred days together. Birthdays were markers of civilian life, not war. But within the American system, a date was a date. And in some camps, particularly those managed with close adherence to morale protocols, birthdays were noted, not for celebration in the traditional sense, but as part of routine welfare management, a small acknowledgement intended to stabilize mental health and reduce tension. In mixed-gender camps, or those with female enclosures attached to larger facilities, this practice occasionally took on unexpected form. Kitchen staff, sometimes assisted by prisoners themselves, prepared simple baked goods using available rations: flour, sugar, powdered eggs. No extravagance, just a small cake, often shared, sometimes plain, occasionally marked with the number scratched into the surface. There was no announcement, no ceremony. The act was quiet, procedural, almost understated. Yet for prisoners who had been conditioned to expect cruelty, this adherence to normalcy carried a different meaning. It challenged assumptions. It disrupted emotional defenses built over years of indoctrination. Within the confines of barbed wire and routine, such moments stood out sharply, not because they were large, but because they were so unexpected. And it was from this collision between expectation and reality that the most powerful reactions emerged, not shouted, not spoken, but visible in silence. That silence would define the moment when routine became something else entirely. The first angle through which this moment must be understood as human, not institutional. Captivity strips life down to repetition. Days lose their edges. Identity narrows to a name on a list, a number on a tag, a face counted during roll call. For the German women in these camps, many of whom had never imagined themselves as prisoners, this compression of life was especially severe. They had been raised inside a system that emphasized collective purpose over individual recognition. Birthdays, while acknowledged in civilian life, were not emphasized in military service. Once in uniform, personal milestones dissolved into duty. Now, in captivity, even that framework was gone. There was no mission, only waiting. Psychologically, this produced a quiet tension. Fear of the unknown future lingered constantly. Some worried about families in bombed cities. Others feared what would happen if the war ended with Germany's defeat. The loss of control was total, and with it came a need to harden emotionally, to expect nothing, to minimize disappointment. It was within this mindset that the unexpected act occurred. A simple baked item, produce without flourish, disrupted that emotional defense. Not because it was generous in material terms, but because it acknowledged individuality in a place designed to erase it. The second angle is that of expectation versus indoctrination. German wartime education had prepared auxiliaries for loyalty and adherence, not mercy from the enemy. American soldiers were portrayed as materially indulgent, morally shallow, and unpredictable in behavior. Treatment of prisoners, especially women, was framed as something to be feared. These narratives were not abstract. They shaped posture, silence, and suspicion. When prisoners entered American camps, they often waited for the moment when restraint would break, when punishment would replace order. Instead, restraint persisted. This consistency created a cognitive dissonance. When the guards followed rules precisely, when inspections were conducted professionally, when Red Cross visits occurred without concealment, the propaganda narrative weakened. The birthday acknowledgement, minor as it was, became another data point, small, but difficult to ignore. The third angle is moral contrast. Total war had erased many boundaries. Cities were bombed. Civilians fled. Atrocities occurred across fronts. In this environment, the deliberate maintenance of humane standards inside POW camps stood in stark contrast to the wider violence of the war. This was not accidental. American military leadership understood that how prisoners were treated reflected not only on ethics, but on discipline. Camps were extensions of the army, not exceptions to it. Guards were reminded that mistreatment undermined authority and could provoke unrest. For the prisoners, this meant that the power they faced was controlled, not arbitrary. The birthday gesture reinforced this perception. It suggested that authority could coexist with restraint, a concept at odds with what many had experienced under the regime they served. The fourth angle is the enemy's perspective. Experienced without words, reactions were not dramatic. There were no cheers. Instead, there was hesitation, stillness, a careful examination of something that seemed out of place. Some prisoners shared the item quietly. Others hesitated before touching it. Years of scarcity and fear had taught them to be cautious. But once accepted, the meaning settled in slowly. This was not humiliation. It was not manipulation. It was procedural humanity, unsettling precisely because it was so ordinary. Finally, there is the angle of silence itself. In war, noise dominates. Orders, explosions, engines. Captivity is quieter, but still filled with internal noise, anxiety, anticipation, memory. Moments like this cut through that noise. They did not inspire joy in the conventional sense. They inspired pause. That pause mattered. It marked the beginning of a shift in how some prisoners perceived their captors, not as caricatures, but as participants in a system governed by rules that extended even to the defeated. That shift would deepen as the war moved closer to its end, and as moments like this accumulated into something larger than any single act. Another angle emerges when the moment is examined through logistics rather than emotion. In wartime, nothing is accidental. Even a small cake requires ingredients, authorization, and time. Flour, sugar, and powdered eggs were controlled resources. Their use inside a POW camp reflected decisions made far from the barracks. Decisions about supply priorities, morale management, and administrative discretion. American POW camps were integrated into the broader logistical network of the U.S. Army. Food distribution followed strict accounting procedures. Any deviation, even for morale purposes, required justification. That these small acknowledgments occurred at all indicates a system confident in its capacity. One not operating at the edge of collapse, but within a framework stable enough to permit restraint. This stability stood in contrast to conditions inside Germany at the same time. By early 1945, German civilians faced shortages that made such gestures impossible. Ration cards were cut repeatedly. Bakeries closed. The symbolic power of a simple baked item, therefore, extended beyond the camp fence. It reflected a widening gap between the resources of the captor and the reality of the captured nation. The leadership angle reinforces this interpretation. Camp commandants were evaluated on order, compliance, and incident reduction. Humane treatment was not sentimental. It was pragmatic. Prisoners who felt less threatened were easier to manage. Small acknowledgments of normalcy reduced tension and discouraged resistance. Officers overseeing female prisoners were particularly cautious. International scrutiny was high. Any allegation of misconduct could have diplomatic consequences. As a result, procedures were followed meticulously. Guards were rotated. Written conduct guidelines were enforced. The camp itself became a controlled environment where predictability was a tool of authority. The gender dimension adds another layer. Female prisoners occupied a liminal space in wartime captivity. They were simultaneously seen as less threatening and more vulnerable. This dual perception influenced policy. While security remained firm, interactions were regulated to avoid both abuse and familiarity. For the prisoners, this produced an unfamiliar dynamic. Power was present, but it was distant. Authority was exercised through routine rather than intimidation. The birthday acknowledgement fit within this pattern, a bounded, regulated act that did not cross into sentimentality. The technological and administrative angle also matters. Detailed record-keeping made such moments possible. Without accurate intake forms, birth dates would have been lost in the mass of prisoners. The bureaucracy, often criticized for its coldness, enabled this small recognition by preserving individual data within an impersonal system. This paradox, humanity emerging from procedure, is central to understanding the moment. It was not driven by personal relationships or improvisation. It emerged because the system functioned as designed. The moral angle, often oversimplified in post-war narratives, is more complex here. This was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. The war continued. Bombs still fell. Soldiers still died. The camps existed to detain the enemy until victory was secured. Yet within that reality, the maintenance of humane standards carried moral weight. It demonstrated that total war did not require total abandonment of restraint. That even at its most destructive, the conflict left room for controlled decency. For the German women experiencing this, the realization unfolded slowly. It did not erase fear or uncertainty, but it altered the emotional landscape. The enemy was no longer an abstract threat. It was an institution, one that operated differently than expected. As the weeks passed and the war moved toward its conclusion, moments like this accumulated quietly. They did not dominate memory, but they lingered. And when the decisive shift finally came, when the war in the West reached its breaking point, those memories shaped how the end was understood. That end would arrive suddenly, and with it, a final transformation in the meaning of captivity itself. By the spring of 1945, the structure of the war in Western Europe had begun to unravel with visible speed. The Rhine had been crossed. German resistance, though still dangerous, was fractured. Entire units surrendered without orders. The certainty that had once defined the Reich's military posture dissolved into fragmented commands and isolated decisions. Inside the POW camps, the shift was felt before it was fully understood. Guard routines tightened, not out of fear, but preparation. Paperwork increased. Lists were updated more frequently. The administrative machinery anticipated an end that had not yet been formally declared. It was during this period of transition that the moment involving the birthday cakes reached its fullest significance. No longer an isolated occurrence, it became part of a pattern of controlled normalcy, a signal that the system was preparing for resolution rather than escalation. The women in captivity noticed changes. News filtered in indirectly. Allied aircraft passed overhead in increasing numbers. The tone of guards remained professional, but the urgency of earlier months had faded. The war's momentum had shifted decisively. When names were read and the small acknowledgement delivered, the reactions were still restrained. But the context had changed. The war was no longer a distant, uncertain force. Its outcome was becoming unavoidable. In that environment, the recognition of a birthday carried a different weight. It suggested continuity beyond the conflict, an implication that life, in some form, would resume. That individuals would outlast uniforms and orders. This realization marked a turning point in how captivity was perceived. Earlier, prisoners had defined themselves by what they had lost: freedom, status, certainty. Now, the focus shifted toward what remained: identity, memory, the possibility of return. For the American administration, this was not an emotional calculation. It was procedural. As victory approached, planning shifted toward repatriation. Accurate records mattered more than ever. Prisoners would need to be transferred, processed, and eventually released. Maintaining order and morale was essential to prevent incidents during this transition. The birthday acknowledgement, small as it was, fit into this broader objective. It reinforced stability at a moment when instability could have been dangerous. It reminded prisoners that the system they were inside was not collapsing. It was concluding. The emotional impact was subtle, but profound. There were no visible celebrations. Instead, there was reflection. Some prisoners stored the memory carefully, as if unsure whether it was real. Others spoke little of it, but carried it forward internally. What mattered was not the act itself, but what it represented: a clear divergence between expectation and experience at the very moment when the war's meaning was being reassessed. As Germany's defeat became inevitable, The psychological battle ended before the physical one did. The narratives that had sustained belief in adherence no longer held. In their place emerged a quieter understanding that surrender did not automatically mean degradation, and that defeat did not erase humanity. That understanding would be tested fully when the war formally ended, and captivity shifted from wartime necessity to post-war reality. In early May 1945, the final sequence unfolded with administrative precision. Germany's military collapse was no longer theoretical. Communications broke down. Orders contradicted each other or failed to arrive at all. On May 7th in Reims, German representatives signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. Within days, the war in Europe was officially over. For the prisoners, the announcement did not arrive with fanfare. There were no celebrations inside the camps. Instead, the information filtered through routine, a briefing here, a change in schedule there. The reality of the war's end was absorbed slowly, as if the mind needed time to accept what the body had endured. The meaning of captivity shifted immediately. Prisoners were no longer enemy combatants held for the duration of hostilities. They became individuals awaiting processing in a post-war world that had yet to define itself. This transition demanded discipline on both sides of the wire. American camp administration entered its final operational phase. Records were reviewed. Medical evaluations were updated. Lists were prepared for transfer and eventual repatriation. Order had to be maintained until the last day. Any lapse could undermine months of careful management. It was in this context that the earlier moments, the birthdays noted, the routines preserved, the small acts of procedural humanity, revealed their full significance. They had prepared prisoners psychologically for this transition. The camps had not taught freedom, but they had taught predictability. And predictability made change survivable. For the German women, the end of the war forced a reckoning with memory. Captivity would become part of their personal history, riddled in fragments years later. Not as a story of comfort, but as a story of contrast. Between what they had feared and what they experienced, the birthday acknowledgement, recalled in post-war testimonies and memoirs, often appeared as a quiet marker rather than a central event. It was remembered not for the food, but for the feeling of being seen at a moment when identity felt suspended. This did not erase the trauma of defeat. Many returned to destroyed cities. Families were missing. The political world they had known no longer existed. But captivity, at least in these camps, had not added cruelty to loss for American forces. The war ended with a record under scrutiny. How prisoners had been treated would be examined by allies and former enemies alike. The adherence to procedure, even in small matters, became part of the broader historical judgment of conduct. The turning point, then, was not dramatic. It did not involve violence or confrontation. It involved closure, a system designed for war completing its task without abandoning restraint. As camps prepared to empty and the fences to lose their purpose, the meaning of those small moments crystallized. They were not anomalies. They were evidence of a philosophy carried through to the end. And when the prisoners finally left, carrying little more than papers and memory, those moments traveled with them, quiet, intact, and unresolved. What remained was the question of how such experiences would be understood once the war receded. Into history. The immediate aftermath of the war unfolded unevenly across Europe. Victory did not restore order overnight. Infrastructure lay in ruins. Governments collapsed or reformed under occupation. For former prisoners of war, freedom arrived not as a single moment, but as a process, delayed, regulated, and shaped by logistical reality. German women held in American-run camps were among the first to be processed for release. Though release itself was conditional, medical screenings came first. Records were checked and rechecked. Transportation networks, damaged by years of bombing, limited movement. Repatriation occurred in stages, often weeks or months after surrender. During this period, camp routines remained largely intact. The same procedures that had governed captivity now governed transition. Meals were served, roll calls conducted, inspections continued. This continuity prevented chaos at a moment when emotions ran high and the future was uncertain. The psychological state of the prisoners shifted gradually. Relief was present, but so was anxiety. Returning home meant confronting loss, destroyed cities, missing relatives, a society under occupation. For many women, captivity had been the most stable environment they had known in months. In this context, memories from the camps took on greater clarity. Post-war interviews and written accounts rarely focused on physical conditions, which were described as adequate but unremarkable. Instead, they highlighted contrast, the difference between expectation and experience. The birthday acknowledgement appeared in these accounts not as a symbol of kindness, but as a symbol of order. It represented a moment when the machinery of war paused just long enough to register the individual. That recognition, small and bounded, became a reference point for understanding the nature of captivity. Comparisons with other fronts reinforced this perception. News of conditions in Soviet-run camps reached the West slowly, but when it did, the differences were stark. Starvation, forced labor, prolonged detention. Against that backdrop, American adherence to international standards stood out sharply. This contrast did not produce gratitude in a simple sense. Defeat remained defeat, loss remained loss. But it influenced how former prisoners described their captors, not as benevolent, but as controlled. For the American military, the aftermath involved documentation and evaluation. Reports were filed, inspections reviewed. Compliance with the Geneva Convention was recorded as part of the official record. The conduct of POW camps became a point of reference in post-war legal and moral assessments. These assessments mattered. They shaped occupation policy. They influenced how former enemies interacted in the early years of Reconstruction. Trust, fragile and limited, depended in part on the memory of restraint. As the camps emptied and their purpose dissolved, the physical structures faded from view. Barracks were dismantled or repurposed. Fences were removed. But the experiences contained within them did not disappear. They remained in memory, incomplete and unresolved, waiting for a broader historical framework to give them meaning. That framework would emerge slowly, as individuals began to place their personal experiences within the larger narrative of the war's end. In the years that followed, the war receded from immediacy into memory, and memory itself became selective. For former German prisoners, especially women who had served in auxiliary roles, captivity in the West occupied an uncertain place in post-war narratives. It did not fit neatly into stories of heroism or victimhood. It was neither triumph nor atrocity. It existed in between. As Germany rebuilt, public discussion of the war focused on devastation, displacement, and accountability. Personal experiences inside Allied POW camps surfaced quietly, often in private memoirs, interviews, or family conversations rather than public testimony. When they did appear, they were marked by restraint, mirroring the environment they described. The birthday acknowledgement, when mentioned at all, was rarely dramatized. It appeared as a detail, sometimes a single sentence. Yet its persistence across accounts suggests its significance, not because it was extraordinary in material terms, but because it contradicted expectation at a moment of extreme vulnerability. This contradiction shaped long-term perception. For many former prisoners, it complicated the image of the enemy. The United States Army was remembered not as compassionate, but as consistent. Rules were followed. Boundaries were maintained. Power was exercised with distance rather than impulse. These recollections influenced how post-war German society interpreted defeat. The collapse of the Reich was total, but the conduct of the victor mattered. It affected how former enemies could coexist within emerging political alliances. By the early 1950s, West Germany and the United States were no longer adversaries, but partners within a new geopolitical framework. Historians examining POW treatment have returned repeatedly to these camps as case studies, not to praise them, but to understand how large institutions behave under pressure. The American system's emphasis on procedure over emotion emerges as a defining characteristic. The birthday cakes, when viewed through this lens, become evidence of a system functioning as designed. They also serve as reminders of scale. World War II was defined by mass death and destruction. Against that backdrop, small acts risk being dismissed as irrelevant. Yet history is experienced individually. For those inside the wire, small moments shaped understanding more powerfully than abstract statistics. The moral legacy of the war is often debated in terms of grand decisions, invasions, bombings, treaties. But it is also preserved in these quiet spaces, where power encountered vulnerability without collapsing into cruelty. As decades passed, memory softened. The camps became footnotes. The war became history. But the contrast remained intact between what was feared and what occurred. That contrast does not redeem the war, nor does it diminish its devastation. It simply records that even within total conflict, restraint was possible and that its presence mattered. Understanding why it mattered requires stepping back, away from the camps and into the broader arc of history itself. War is remembered for its extremes, for the moments when restraint collapses and violence overwhelms reason. World War II, more than any conflict before it, defined itself through scale, cities erased, armies shattered, millions displaced or killed. In such a landscape, small moments risk disappearing entirely. Yet history is not lived at the scale of maps and numbers. It is lived in rooms and routines and pauses between fear and acceptance. For the German women held in American prisoner of war camps, captivity was not a story of mercy or punishment. It was a story of order maintained at the edge of chaos. The birthday cakes did not change the course of the war. They did not soften defeat or erase loss. Their significance lies elsewhere. They represented a system choosing to remain disciplined when discipline was no longer necessary for victory. They demonstrated that power could be exercised without humiliation, even against a defeated enemy. This distinction matters because it shaped what followed. Post-war reconciliation, fragile and incomplete, depended on memory as much as policy. How people remembered their enemies influenced how they accepted peace. The contrast between expectation and experience became part of that memory. The American approach to captivity did not emerge from sentimentality. It emerged from structure, from laws, procedures, and a belief that restraint strengthened authority rather than weakened it. In the aftermath of total war, that belief proved consequential for those who experienced it. The moment remained unresolved, neither forgiveness nor condemnation, simply a reminder that even in the most destructive conflict in human history, choices still existed. History does not ask us to celebrate such moments. It asks us to notice them, because in noticing them, we understand not how wars are won, but how they end.